June 4, 1942. Somewhere over the Pacific, 14 aircraft climbed into an empty sky with no fighter escort, no clear coordinates, and fuel gauges already dropping toward the red. Their target was a Japanese carrier force that had already moved. Their launch had come late. Too late, some said. The men in those cockpits had been told they might not find anything at all. They had been told they might not come back. What no one told them was that their arrival, against every calculation, would change the course of a war. The morning of June 4, 1942, began in darkness aboard the American carriers northeast of Midway Atoll. The sea was calm, deceptively so, with long swells rolling beneath a ceiling of scattered clouds. The air smelled of salt and aviation fuel, and the metallic bite of tension that hung over every flight deck in the Pacific that summer. 3 carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, had positioned themselves in ambush. Intelligence, hard-won and fragile, had given the Americans something they rarely possessed in those early months of the war: knowledge of where the enemy would be. 4 Japanese carriers were steaming toward Midway. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Strike first, strike hard, sink them before they could strike back. But war does not obey plans. By 0700, the first American strike groups had already launched. Torpedo bombers from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had roared off the deck and vanished into the western sky. Dive bombers followed. Fighters climbed to altitude. The choreography of carrier aviation unfolded across 3 ships, each sending its aircraft into the unknown. Yet aboard Enterprise, one group remained on deck. Bombing Squadron 6, 14 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers, sat motionless, their crews watching the others disappear over the horizon. Their launch had been delayed. Fuel calculations had shifted. Coordination with other squadrons had faltered. By the time they were finally ordered into the air, the carefully synchronized American attack had already fragmented into scattered groups, flying on divergent headings, each searching for an enemy fleet that might or might not be where they expected. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, the Air Group commander, led the 14 Dauntlesses off Enterprise's deck at 0752. They climbed into the pale morning light, their engines settling into the steady drone that would become their only companion for the next 2 hours. Behind them, the carrier shrank to a gray sliver, then vanished entirely. McClusky's orders were clear. Proceed to the expected intercept point, locate the Japanese carriers, and attack. What the orders could not provide was certainty. The coordinates he had been given were already old. The enemy was moving. The Pacific stretched out beneath him in every direction, a blue emptiness that swallowed distance and direction alike. The 14 aircraft flew in formation, their wings catching the morning sun. Below them, the ocean offered no landmarks, no reference points, nothing but the slow crawl of whitecaps across an infinite surface. Each pilot held his position, checked his instruments, and waited. The fuel gauges, even now, were their most honest companions. Every minute of flight was a minute subtracted from their return. No one aboard those aircraft knew what was happening to the other strike groups. Waldron's torpedo bombers at that very moment were flying into annihilation. Hornet's dive bombers, led astray by a navigation error, would never find the enemy at all. The battle that would decide the Pacific War was already unfolding in chaos, confusion, and tragedy, and McClusky's 14 Dauntlesses flew on, alone, into an empty sky. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Wade McClusky had not always been a dive bomber pilot. He had not always been destined for the cockpit that would carry him into history. Born in 1902 in Buffalo, New York, McClusky grew up in a world where flight was still a novelty, where the idea of launching aircraft from ships at sea belonged to the realm of speculation and adventure novels. His path to Annapolis came through determination rather than privilege, a young man from a working-class family who saw the Navy as a way forward. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926, in that strange interwar period when naval aviation was still fighting for legitimacy within its own service. Battleship admirals dominated the fleet. Aircraft were seen as useful for scouting, perhaps, but not for the decisive work of war. McClusky chose flight training anyway. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, he accumulated hours in cockpits that would seem primitive by 1942 standards: biplanes with open cockpits, fabric-covered wings, engines that coughed and sputtered in the salt air. He flew fighters first, then transitioned through various squadrons as the Navy slowly, grudgingly, expanded its aviation arm. By the time war came to Pearl Harbor, McClusky was 40 years old, older than most of the pilots under his command. He had spent nearly 2 decades in uniform, watching the service evolve, watching aircraft grow faster and more deadly, watching the carrier transform from an experiment into the centerpiece of naval warfare. He understood, perhaps better than younger men, what the machines could do and what they could not. The Douglas SBD Dauntless he flew on June 4th was a sturdy, reliable aircraft, neither glamorous nor particularly fast. It carried a crew of 2, pilot and rear gunner, and could deliver a single 1,000-pound bomb with remarkable accuracy if the pilot held his nerve through the dive. Its maximum range, under optimal conditions, was roughly 1,115 miles. Optimal conditions, of course, rarely existed in combat. McClusky's rear seat gunner that morning was Aviation Radio Man First Class Walter Chokalusik, a quiet professional who had flown with McClusky before and knew the routines of carrier aviation intimately. The 2 men communicated through brief exchanges over the intercom, their voices competing with engine noise and wind. The other 13 aircraft carried similar crews, pilots and gunners drawn from the pool of young men who had volunteered for naval aviation in the years before and after Pearl Harbor. Some were Annapolis graduates, others had come through the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, civilians transformed into combat aviators in a matter of months. All of them, by June 1942, had trained for a moment they could not fully imagine. What separated McClusky from the pilots he commanded was not skill alone. It was experience, the accumulated judgment that comes from thousands of hours in the air, from learning what weather does to navigation, what fatigue does to decision-making, what fear does to the human mind at altitude. He had seen enough to know that plans rarely survived contact with reality. That knowledge would prove decisive. By 09:20, McClusky's formation had reached the expected intercept point, the coordinates where the Japanese carriers should have been. The ocean below was empty, no ships, no wakes, no telltale smudges of smoke on the horizon. The 14 Dauntlesses circled slowly, their pilots scanning in every direction, searching for any sign of the enemy fleet they had been sent to destroy. There was nothing. The problem was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was unforgiving. McClusky's aircraft had already consumed roughly half their fuel reaching this point. The return flight to Enterprise would consume most of what remained. Every minute spent searching extended the flight time, subtracted from the already thin margin of safety, and increased the likelihood that some or all of the aircraft would never make it back to the ship. Standard doctrine offered a clear answer: return to the carrier. If the target was not at the expected location, prudent airmanship demanded conservation of fuel and the preservation of aircraft and crews for future strikes. A commander who led his men into the ocean through fuel exhaustion would bear responsibility for their deaths. McClusky understood this calculus perfectly. He also understood something else, something that doctrine could not quantify. The Japanese carriers were out there, somewhere. They had not vanished. They had simply moved, following their own operational logic, adjusting to circumstances McClusky could not see. If he returned to Enterprise empty-handed, the enemy would remain unlocated, free to strike American ships, free to complete whatever mission had brought them to Midway. The battle, in that moment, hung on a single decision. McClusky made a choice that defied the textbook. Rather than returning immediately, he would expand the search. He would gamble his fuel, his aircraft, and the lives of his crews on the possibility of finding the enemy before it was too late. He turned the formation to the northwest, following a hunch born of experience. If the Japanese carriers had been heading toward Midway, they might have altered course after launching their own strikes. They might be recovering aircraft, adjusting position, doing any of the 100 things a carrier force does in the chaos of battle. If he could find some trace of their movement, some indication of their direction, he might yet locate them. The 14 Dauntlesses flew on, their fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. At 0955, McClusky spotted something. Below, cutting a white line across the blue Pacific, was a single ship moving at high speed. It was not a carrier. It was smaller, sleeker, a destroyer perhaps, racing alone across the open water. In later years, the identity of that vessel would become a matter of historical debate. McClusky believed it to be a Japanese destroyer hurrying to catch up with the main fleet. The wake it left pointed like an arrow toward the northwest. McClusky followed the heading. The decision to follow that single ship's wake was not reckless. It was calculated desperation. McClusky knew his fuel situation precisely. He knew that every mile flown to the northwest was a mile added to the return journey. He knew that some of his aircraft, if the search extended much further, would not have enough fuel to reach Enterprise. They would go into the water, and in the vastness of the Pacific, rescue was never certain. But he also knew that the entire American position at Midway depended on finding and destroying those carriers. The Japanese had already demonstrated at Pearl Harbor, and in the months since, what carrier aviation could accomplish. If their 4 fleet carriers remained operational, they could devastate Midway's defenses, turn the battle into a Japanese victory, and extend their reach across the Central Pacific. The strategic logic was relentless. Those carriers had to be found. They had to be sunk. Everything else was secondary. McClusky's gamble was not merely personal. It placed the lives of 27 other men, his rear gunners, and the crews of 13 other aircraft in the balance. None of them had voted on the decision. None of them could override it. They followed because that was what military aviation demanded, trust in the commander's judgment, even when the fuel gauges told a different story. The minutes stretched out. The sun climbed higher. The Pacific remained empty, and then, at approximately 1,000, the horizon changed. McClusky spotted white specks against the blue. Wakes. Multiple wakes, spreading across the ocean in the distinctive pattern of a fleet underway. As the formation drew closer, the specks resolved into shapes. Ships, many ships, and among them, unmistakable even at distance, the broad flight decks of aircraft carriers. The Japanese striking force was below. From his altitude, McClusky could see 4 carriers arranged in a rough box formation, surrounded by escorts. Their flight decks appeared to be spotted with aircraft, fighters and bombers being armed, fueled, or prepared for launch. The enemy was not at rest. They were in the midst of their own operational cycle, perhaps preparing a strike of their own. What McClusky could not see, what no American pilot in the sky that morning could know, was the chaos unfolding on those flight decks. Japanese commanders were wrestling with a cruel dilemma: whether to arm their aircraft for another strike on Midway or to rearm them with torpedoes for a strike on the American carriers they had just discovered. The flight decks were cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft in various states of readiness. The timing of McClusky's arrival was, in retrospect, almost impossibly fortunate. But fortune was not guaranteed to produce results. McClusky's 14 Dauntlesses were alone. The torpedo bombers that should have attacked first, drawing enemy fighters down to sea level, had already been destroyed or scattered. The fighter escort that should have protected the dive bombers had never joined them. The coordinated assault that American doctrine prescribed had collapsed into fragments. And yet, at that precise moment, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters that had been slaughtering American torpedo bombers for the past hour, were at low altitude, low on fuel, and low on ammunition. They had done their work too well. There was almost nothing left to intercept a high-altitude attack. McClusky ordered the attack. The dive began at approximately 10,020 feet. McClusky pushed the nose of his Dauntless over and felt the aircraft respond, the horizon tilting, the blue Pacific rotating beneath him as gravity and aerodynamics pulled him downward. The airspeed climbed. The wind roared past the canopy. The carrier below grew from a gray rectangle into a detailed landscape of flight deck, island structure, and clustered aircraft. A dive-bombing attack was an act of controlled violence against both the enemy and the pilot's own instincts. The natural response to falling toward the earth at several hundred miles per hour was panic. Training overwrote that response, replacing it with procedures, checkpoints, and the mechanical rhythm of altitude, airspeed, and release point. The Dauntless was designed for this. Its perforated dive brakes, extended behind the wings, slowed the descent enough to allow accurate aiming. The pilot looked through his bomb sight, adjusting for wind, drift, and the movement of the target below. The rear gunner watched for enemy fighters and called out anything the pilot needed to hear. McClusky's target was the carrier Kaga, the largest of the 4 Japanese flat-tops in the formation. As he dove, he could see the details resolving: the rising sun painted on the forward flight deck, the aircraft clustered aft, the crews on deck who had only seconds to realize what was coming. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around him. Black puffs of smoke, the orange flash of muzzle blasts from the escorts, the tracers arcing upward in desperate streams. At dive-bombing altitude, there was no evasive maneuvering. The pilot held his line, absorbed whatever the enemy threw at him, and trusted that speed and angle would carry him through. McClusky released his bomb at approximately 2,500 feet and pulled out of the dive, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the Dauntless fought to recover its altitude. Behind him, the bomb fell, a dark shape arcing downward toward the carrier's flight deck. He did not see the impact. The violence of the pullout, the need to clear the area, the presence of other aircraft diving behind him, all of it demanded immediate attention. What mattered was that he had delivered his weapon. What happened next was beyond his control. The other pilots of Bombing Squadron 6 followed, each one pushing into his own dive, each one fighting the same battle against physics and fear and the enemy guns below. Lieutenant Richard Best led a section toward a second carrier, Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese striking force. Lieutenant Junior Grade Norman Kleiss dove toward Kaga, adding his bomb to the strike. The attacks lasted only minutes. Dive bombing was measured in seconds. The dive, the release, the pullout, the desperate escape at low altitude where the Zero fighters waited. When the smoke began to clear, the results became visible from the aircraft still circling above. Kaga was burning. Multiple bombs had struck her flight deck, detonating among the armed and fueled aircraft parked there. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck as fuel and ordnance cooked off in cascading detonations. Akagi was burning too. At least one bomb had penetrated her flight deck, igniting the same catastrophic chain reaction of fuel and munitions. A third carrier, Soryu, was under attack from aircraft launched from Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Bombing Squadron 3 had arrived at almost exactly the same moment, by coincidence or providence, or the strange mathematics of carrier warfare. Soryu was also in flames. 3 of 4 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded in less than 5 minutes. The fourth, Hiryu, remained untouched, hidden by distance and smoke. She would launch a counterstrike that afternoon, damaging Yorktown severely. But Hiryu's survival was temporary. American aircraft would find her before sunset, and she too would burn. McClusky's 14 Dauntlesses had not accomplished this alone. The attack was a convergence of multiple squadrons, arriving from different carriers at almost the same moment, their scattered approaches accidentally producing the massed assault that Doctrine had failed to coordinate. The sacrifice of the torpedo bomber squadrons, flying into destruction without fighter cover, had drawn down the Japanese fighters and created the opening that McClusky's dive bombers exploited. But none of it would have mattered if McClusky had turned back when his fuel situation demanded it. None of it would have mattered if he had followed the textbook. The decision to press on, to follow that single destroyer's wake, to gamble everything on finding the enemy. That decision made the rest possible. The return flight to Enterprise was, in some ways, harder than the attack itself. McClusky's aircraft had been hit during the dive, bullet holes stitching the fuselage, damage to control surfaces that made the Dauntless sluggish and unresponsive. His fuel gauge, which had been his constant enemy all morning, now showed a number that promised only uncertainty. The 14 aircraft that had launched together were no longer 14. Some had been shot down over the carriers. Others had been damaged and were struggling to stay airborne. At least one pilot, unable to make it back, would ditch his aircraft in the open ocean and spend hours in his life raft before rescue. McClusky himself barely made it. When his wheels touched Enterprise's deck, his fuel tanks were essentially empty. The margin between survival and loss was measured in gallons, perhaps in minutes. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Debriefings, rearming, the frantic preparations for follow-up strikes against the surviving Japanese carrier. There was no time for reflection. The battle continued, and the men who could still fly would be needed again. But in the days and weeks that followed, as the scope of what had happened at Midway became clear, the significance of McClusky's decision began to crystallize. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes represented the most devastating blow ever inflicted on a carrier force in naval history. The 4th carrier's loss, hours later, completed the catastrophe. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and over 200 trained naval aviators, losses that could not be replaced quickly, if at all. American losses were significant. 1 carrier, Yorktown, sunk. Nearly 150 aircraft lost. Over 300 Americans killed. The torpedo bomber squadrons had been virtually annihilated, their sacrifice both heroic and agonizing in its cost. But the strategic balance had shifted. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative in the Pacific, striking at will, choosing when and where to engage. After Midway, that initiative passed to the Americans. The long, grinding advance that would take American forces from Guadalcanal to the Philippines to the Japanese home islands began in the aftermath of those 5 minutes over the Kido Butai. Military historians would spend decades analyzing the battle, debating the decisions that shaped its outcome. The role of intelligence, the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers, the mistakes of Japanese commanders, all of these factors mattered. But McClusky's decision to continue the search, to ignore the fuel gauges and follow a hunch across an empty ocean, emerged as one of the pivotal moments. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, in his post-battle report, credited McClusky's leadership with deciding the fate of the carrier force. The measured language of official correspondence could not capture what that decision had actually meant in the cockpit of a fuel-starved Dauntless over the Pacific. It could not capture the loneliness of command at 20,000 feet, the weight of knowing that 13 other aircraft and their crews depended on a choice that might kill them all. McClusky was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. The citation noted his gallantry and determination. What it could not note was the moment of doubt he must have felt when the expected intercept point proved empty, when the textbook answer was to turn back, when everything he had been trained to do pointed toward the safe decision. He made a different choice. Wade McClusky survived the war. His wounds from Midway healed, though they kept him from further combat flying for months. He served in various shore assignments, contributed to the training of new pilots, and watched from a distance as the war he had helped to turn moved toward its inevitable conclusion. He retired from the Navy in 1956, having risen to the rank of Rear Admiral. In the years that followed, he lived quietly, gave occasional interviews about the battle, and saw his decision enter the historical record as one of the defining moments of the Pacific War. He died in 1976 in Annapolis, not far from the institution that had shaped him as a young man. The airfield at Naval Air Station Midway was eventually named McClusky Field in his honor. It was a modest tribute for a man whose 5-minute flight over the enemy carriers had compressed strategic necessity, personal courage, and catastrophic violence into a single irreversible act. What Midway demonstrated, beyond the tactics and the ordnance and the damage reports, was something about the nature of decisive moments in war. They do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with clarity or certainty. They come disguised as fuel shortages and empty horizons, and the gnawing suspicion that the right thing to do might also be the fatal thing. The pilots who followed McClusky that morning did so without knowing they were flying into history. They followed because their commander asked them to, because the mission demanded it, because turning back felt like failure even when it was the rational choice. Some of them did not return. Some of them went into the Pacific and were never found. Their names appear on monuments now, inscribed alongside the names of the torpedo bomber crews who flew into annihilation at wave-top height, alongside the names of every American who gave everything in those desperate months of 1942. What McClusky understood, in the cockpit of his damaged Dauntless as it limped back toward Enterprise, was that the outcome had not been certain. It had not been destined. It had hung on choices made under impossible pressure by men who could not see the full picture, who could only act on incomplete information and trust that action was better than inaction. The fuel gauge had told him to turn back. He had chosen to fly on. That choice, replicated across thousands of similar moments by thousands of men throughout the war, was what separated victory from defeat. Not superior equipment, though that mattered. Not flawless planning, because plans always failed. What mattered was the willingness to persist when persistence seemed irrational, to act when action seemed hopeless, to believe that one more mile, one more minute, one more dive might be the one that changed everything. The 14 aircraft that reached the Japanese fleet had been mocked as too late. They were exactly on time. In the mathematics of naval warfare, timing is everything and nothing. It cannot be planned with precision. It can only be pursued with relentless intent. Fuel gauges and doctrine and common sense be damned. McClusky pursued. The fleet burned. The war turned. Somewhere in that sequence lies the truth about what one person can change and what one choice can cost, and why the careful calculations of headquarters never quite account for the man in the cockpit who refuses to accept that the mission is over. He flew on because he believed there was still something to find. There was,